everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Steph Leune here from .au Domain Administration. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar to discuss the proposed licensing rule changes. Please take note that this presentation is being recorded. If you have any questions during this presentation, please pop them into the chat box and we will try and answer them if possible, if time permits. I would like to start with the acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of this land of which we meet today, the original home of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first people to innovate and use technology on this land and do so for very many millennia after, knowledge upon which we continue to build upon today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us here as we value the opportunity, not just to share an update on the licensing rules or the proposed licensing rules, but also to hear from you. Between us, we all play a vital role in supporting the 4.2 million domain names in the .au space. .au name servers process an average of 6 billion DNS queries each day, and the .au is now the 10th largest TLD globally. The strong registration growth was underpinned by a successful launch of the .au Direct, which we are very proud of, and a focus on maintaining the integrity of the .au domain space. Overall, these results are part of the continual joint effort, and as our research has confirmed, shows the value in maintaining trust. Trust is underpinning the security and integrity and is a key priority for .au. As you'd be aware, the .au DNS is designated a critical infrastructure by the Australian government. The designation highlights its importance to the Australian digital economy and the national security. Our efforts to focus on DNS abuse will continue, and we have now opened our consultation with some minor administrative changes in the .au licensing rules namespace. And that is why we are here today. I would like to introduce Barbara Sade, the Senior Compliance Policy Officer. She will be discussing the proposed changes. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Steph. And thank you everyone for joining us here today to discuss the proposed minor changes. I will just bring up our slides and get right into it. So I'll just start with a quick bird's eye view, actually, of our licensing function at auDA. So under our endorsement from the Australian government, we have a core function, which is to administer a licensing regime for .au domain names based in multi-stakeholder processes, which is a really important part of it. And that licensing regime needs to be transparent, responsive, accountable, accessible, and efficient. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the licensing rules, they're the rules of the .au, and they cover pretty much everything that you would need to do with a domain name in terms of the licensing. So it covers registering, renewing, and transferring a domain name. It covers all the different eligibility and allocation requirements for the different namespaces, such as com.au, org.au, .au direct. It covers registrant obligations, so what you need to do and what you need to keep up to date in terms of your license. It covers cancelling and restoring a license, and then last but not least, the process for making a complaint under the licensing rules. Now, before I get into the substance of the changes, I'll just explain a little bit about the type of changes that we're looking at. So auDA has a corporate policy that divides rule changes into two categories. And the first category is minor administrative, legal, technical changes that are managed by auDA through a multi-stakeholder process involving public consultation. The second category is when we create a new policy or we do a big review of a policy. And then we actually have a policy review panel. And again, the public consultation and multi-stakeholder process. So what we're doing here is looking at some minor administrative changes to the licensing rules. And if we do get submissions that are advocating major changes, we will put them aside and we'll hang on to them for when we next do a major review of the licensing rules. And that review is scheduled for 2025. And obviously there will be a lot of information to the members and to the public about that process when we get that underway. So to actually to see the full list of the proposed changes, what you would need to do is to go to our public consultations page. But here are a few examples of the types of things that we're proposing. So the first one is about DNS abuse, and under the licensing rules, there are a number of prohibited uses for a domain name. You can imagine a prohibited use is something fairly serious. And so we've included DNS as a prohibited use under the licensing rules. And we've also added a definition of DNS abuse under the defined terms. We've also capitalised the defined terms, and that came from some feedback we actually got from a member of the public who said that they were finding it difficult to read the rules and understand what terms were in the defined terms at the beginning of the rules and what were just standard terms. And we thought that was some pretty good feedback. So we've gone through and capitalised all the defined terms just to make it easier to read the rules and to know when to refer back to the definitions section. We have expanded the not-for-profit definition. So we were finding that there were some organisations that we were hearing from that didn't meet the auDA definition, but were actually registered with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. And that was an oversight. So that's an administrative change to basically fix up that oversight. The other thing that we're changing is a minor adjustment to the contractual capacity under the licensing rules and clarifying the deeming provision and also what happens when somebody passes away. So if you're familiar with the rules and the previous rules, you know that when it came to deeming that a license no longer couldn't exist because the registrant no longer existed, there was a process for looking at whether that domain name had been transferred prior to that registrant no longer being in existence. Now, again, I think due to administrative oversight, that wasn't carried across into the new rules, and so we've included that. And also having provisions that apply for when a registrant becomes deceased, when a natural person becomes deceased. There are just a few of the examples. So there obviously are a few more. None of them are substantive or major changes. Like I said, they're the kinds of changes that we're holding over to the next review. So an important part of the licensing regime and how we do these reviews is the multi-stakeholder process. And that's why we're basically asking you to get involved and let us know what you think of the proposed changes. You can go to our website, and I think Steph has put the link. Yep, Steph's put the link in the chat. So you'll find the link for the public consultations page on our website. And what you'll find on there is an explanation of the process. You'll find a marked up copy of the licensing rules. So that actually shows you the current original licensing rules with markups showing all of the proposed changes in red. So it's really obvious where we're looking to change something. And you'll notice that with the capitalisation of defined terms, there are lots of little spots of red all over, but most of it is just us putting capital letters in. But you will see all of the changes in that marked up copy. You'll also see our explanatory statement, and what the explanatory statement does is take you through some of the principles that are involved when we change policies. They explain the process for review, and they also give you an oversight of all of the changes. So you read that in conjunction with the licensing rules. So this webinar is an opportunity for you to find out more and for you to ask us questions. We're also promoting the review with members through a blog, which we'll be putting out after the webinar, and through our social media. So we're really trying to reach as many people as we can who might be interested in having a say on these proposed changes. So this is the process. So like I said, there's a link in the chat. So go to the website, have a look at the changes, have a look at the explanatory statement. You might think they're great, but you can always just send us a submission and say that you agree with them. If you do want to make a submission, can you make sure that it is submitted by the 30th of October? So the process, the period of public consultation runs from the 10th to the 30th of October. All submissions are published on our website, unless you prefer for it to be private, and then let us know and we'll make sure that we don't publish that, but we will list that we've received it. We then will review all of the submissions we get. We will update the rules, or we will come up with a final version of the rules, which will go to the auDA board. And then we're looking at publishing the new version of the licensing rules in 2024, early 2024. While we've got you here, we thought we might just quickly run a few upcoming events past you. So we've got a webinar on the 2nd of November, launching our Digital Lives of Australia's report. And there is a member networking event on the 9th of November. And you can certainly find out more about that on our website. And in terms of membership, if you're not already a member, don't forget that being a member gives you access to exclusive events, briefings and resources. It allows you to have a voice in the future of the .au. And now, if we have any questions, I might just stop sharing, Steph. We can go back to faces.
No problem. So we had a question in the queue in relation to the link. I have shared it on the chat component, and I've also shared it in the question and answer part of it. So anybody can just click on the consultation page. If you don't have the link, there's a very easy way to look it up. You just go to the auDA website, www.auda.org.au. Under consultation, the drop-down list, there's a public consultation, and it is the one that's at the top, which says 10-2023. I've also put in the link for the explanatory guide, and just as a example, I put in the definition of the proposed new DNS abuse definition. So happy for anybody to put some questions in the queue. We didn't have any further questions, but if you have any questions, please, this is your opportunity to actually raise your questions. I actually have a question for you, Barbara. So with these changes, once we have publications that come through or proposals that come through, what happens with them?
Well, they will all be reviewed by the policy compliance team. And we will look at whether there are improved opportunities there, whether people have come up with better options, or, you know, really what the feedback is. And I guess the principle of a multi-stakeholder process is that we're not saying we know best. We're saying we've got a pretty good idea, but we can improve it with your input. So once we've got that all together, we actually do go to the board with all of the submissions as well. So the auDA board gets to see your submission, and then we work out how we put that all into a final version that works.
Thank you. We do have another question, Barbara. Will these changes affect small businesses? If so, how?
Will they affect small businesses? Trying to think which ones might. They are all, I mean, again, because they are fairly minor, they're in terms of tweaks. I can't think of any in particular that would affect small business.
Maybe the deceased estate one, that might make it a bit easier.
That's true. So at the moment, there's nothing. So at the moment, the licensing rules are silent on what happens when someone is deceased, except what they say is that as soon as a registrant ceases to exist, the license name is deemed to be cancelled. So it certainly does make it a little bit easier in that we're now proposing a process that involves the executor that allows a domain name to be passed on where that happens.
And that is specifically pertaining to, especially in situations where it's a sole trader. So
absolutely. And the other deeming provision that we are looking at is where a company ceases to exist. So under the old rules, what would happen is if the company had transferred the licensing, the license for the domain name prior to ceasing to exist, for instance, they'd sold the business or they'd changed their structure, and there was a formal passing on of that domain name. Under the old rules, we could recognise that, but under the new rules, we can't. So we really are fixing that oversight as well, so that small businesses, through oversight or perhaps through administrative error on their side, don't lose access to their domain name.
Fantastic. Next question is, when will these changes actually come into fruition? When will they start, if they do get approved?
So if they do get approved, then it would be early 2024. We don't have a specific date, but it would be within the first couple of months of 2024.
Thank you. Another question we have is, will DNS abuse provisions change on how auDA actually handles DNS abuse?
No. So the licensing rules currently do allow auDA to look at DNS abuse. So we certainly have a lot of power to look at things that impact the integrity, the security of the DNS. And so this is really something to make it more explicit to people that we are looking at DNS abuse, and certainly our processes won't change. They are still the same, which are focused firstly on stopping DNS abuse, but also helping registrants to recognise when they're affected by DNS abuse and how they can mitigate that and make sure it doesn't occur in future.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's talk about the major review. When people actually put up suggestions that do not fall into the remit of the current review, the proposed minor review, what will auDA do with those changes if they are good suggestions? And then when will that process kick off for that major review to start?
Okay, so the idea is that the process for the major review will start probably in the second half of 2024. So there's a bit of work in advertising and getting a policy panel together before we actually start the formal review process. We are very interested in keeping a record of any suggestions. And in fact, when we did this review of the licensing rules, we looked at complaints, we looked at inquiries, we looked at suggestions we got from people. So we're not restricted to just getting ideas through submissions for this major review. We're very happy to take on board suggestions at any time. But we certainly will keep track of those suggestions and make sure that we feed them in. We'll also be encouraging people to come back to us at that stage when we do have the major review. So, you know, it might be something that we encourage people to do that give us major feedback now, is we might tell them that when the major review is on, they should come back to us and provide us that information. But we will certainly keep a record of it ourselves and feed that in.
Did auDA take into account any of the latest auDRP decisions when looking at these reviews, or will it look at the auDRP's decisions and take those into account when reviewing the new rules?
I think when we have our review, so when we have the major review, I think auDRP decisions are certainly something that we are constantly monitoring in any event. So issues that come up in those decisions are certainly front of mind for us. But at the same time, you know, there is a clear distinction between what the auDRP does and what we do under the licensing rules. That said, like I said, it's something that we are across and we are always conscious of.
So let's just clear the, I forgot to explain what auDRP is. Could you just explain to people what auDRP means? Thank you.
So auDRP is auDA's dispute resolution policy. So if two parties have a dispute over intellectual property rather than a licensing issue with a domain name, then they are actually, they have options to go to one of two different organisations that look at IP disputes in relation to .au domain names. So the two bodies are WIPO and the Resolution Institute, so people can make a complaint to them, and those organisations will look at the IP dispute and at the end of the day can either cancel or even transfer a domain name if they feel that that's the best outcome. So it's decision-making that doesn't fall under the licensing rules, but obviously is quite closely connected to the licensing rules.
Okay, we have another question in the queue. Will the changes focus on any particular namespaces, or is it a broad strokes across the whole of .au?
It is across the whole of .au. I think the only namespace specific one is that changing the definition for org.au. All the rest cover all of the namespaces.
Fantastic. Would the changes have a significant impact on the registrars, which is the supply chain or the resellers?
Look, not really. You know, there will be sort of slight adjustments in terms of process, but again, because they are fairly minor administrative changes, they won't really have much of an impact on registrar processes.
Thank you. Any further questions from the team or from any participants online? Give them 10 seconds to really type fast. Perfect. If we don't have any, oh, we've got one more question. Okay, are any other situations anticipated where auDA would agree for WHOIS information not to be disclosed?
Well, at this stage, the short answer is no, but I certainly wouldn't preempt what a policy panel might decide. But at this stage, all we are looking at is aligning what we do with the WHOIS policy with what the Australian Business Register does, which is to allow people to mask their information if it's a matter of personal safety. That's the most common one. Yes. So at this stage, that's the only change that we are proposing or that we foresee.
And also, if we have any changes to the WHOIS policy, that is a significant change, which will actually have to go through the whole policy review process and public consultation. So it's not just a quick changeover. I can't see any more questions in the queue. I'm going to say thank you to Barbara Sade for actually sharing. Oh, we've got another question quickly. Sorry. Around when an entity's case ceases to exist, the compliance team appears to have some discretion around granting extensions and etc. Is this something that will be reflected in the rules?
So I guess this is the change. This change will reflect that discretion to some extent. So this change will allow us to look at whether that transfer occurred before an entity ceased to exist. What we also have, our approach to applying the licensing rules is we also have our compliance posture. And our compliance posture is based on fairness and is also based on, a three-step approach where we're communicating and educating with people initially, we're guiding and facilitating compliance, and we're only moving to enforcement if we feel that's necessary, if those other steps haven't worked.
Thank you. And we do also always take into account that, especially with entities where a situation like this has happened, it usually has been over a long period of time. So there's lots of documentation that needs to be collated, and it's not always at everybody's fingertips. So we do take that into consideration when it comes to applying an extension, a reasonable extension to people to actually gather that information and supply it to us so that they can hold on to their business identity. Fantastic. I don't have any more questions in the queue. Again, I'd like to say thank you very much, Barbara. Very informative. I really appreciate all the knowledge that you shared with us. And I'd really like to implore the participants on the call, if you want to have your say, you've got the link, by all means, put in a submission. We've got a team of people that will read them and actually take them into consideration. As I said, we do take this process very seriously, and we want to make a difference in the .au namespace. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Goodbye.